Here's a little secret for you. There was a time many years ago, before I started making videos on YouTube, that I was kind of a fan of Stefan Molyneux. I mean, not seriously. I watched some of his videos on SJWs and the political left, and I thought those were okay. But it was when I found out that he was a wingnut libertarian fruitcake that I gave up and went elsewhere. Libertarians, at least the extreme versions, are insane. But I always wanted a good vehicle to point out how, and I think I found it. Here, Stefan argues for objective ethics using his so-called universally preferable behavior method, which almost immediately falls apart. So sit back and strap in as I take a look at Stefan Molyneux's supposed philosophical system and why it just doesn't hold up to the hype. Enjoy!
Good morning, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Stefan Molyneux. I hope that you're ready for your daily argument. Today we're going to be talking about ethics, the most important work I think that I've done as a philosopher, and I believe the most important work that can be done in philosophy.
Sure, that's not tooting your own horn or anything, is it? And that's something that you'll notice if you watch any significant number of his videos. He's got an ego. He's not here to have a discussion. He's here to pontificate. He's here to educate. He wants you to think like he does, even if the way he thinks makes no sense whatsoever. And it's kind of obnoxious, at least in my opinion.
We're going to talk about my theory of ethics called universally preferable behavior. It's going to be a very brief introduction. If you want more, and I really hope that you do, then please check out my free book, Universally Preferable Behavior, a rational proof of secular ethics, that is available at freedomainradio.com/free.
Why does that sound like the same kind of thing the religious do? Read my tract, available online, or stuffed under your welcome mat, because nobody in their right mind would ever pay for this thing. For a good libertarian who supposedly wants to make money, he can't find anybody willing to publish his screed.
So, let's dive in, shall we? The question, I guess, is first, why? Why bother with a system of ethics? Well, I guess you really can't help but notice these days that since the fall of Christianity as a central ethos or set of virtues for Western civilization, well, we've been just a little bit lost and adrift, and in some ways I think we're now circling the drain.
No, not really. I don't think Christianity has anything to do with it. After all, the majority of Americans still purport to be Christian. Christianity hasn't gone away as much as I think it would be a net positive for it to do so. What has gone away is the open supernatural threats of violence against those who don't do what the church wants them to do, and the open physical threats of violence by the religious against those who disagree. And I think that a libertarian would be completely on board with eliminating threats, especially for mind crimes. But hey, what do I know, right?
And so the problem I've had with a lot of atheists and secularists is what they've done is they kind of ripped the roof off the church during the hailstorm of internecine warfare that characterizes most of human history. They tore down the church, drove people out of the church, but gave them no new place to shelter themselves. And so now people are just kind of lost and wandering and scared. They don't have a community. They don't have a central system of belief. And, well, let's just say the West has become pretty damn easy pickings. So,
I hate to say it, but it's not the job of the atheists to comfort and protect the formerly delusional. In fact, it shows just how empty those beliefs actually are, that once they're gone, these people have no idea what the hell to do with themselves. In fact, people need to be able to step back and evaluate reality and their place in it as individuals, and then come together in society and form rational standards for behavior. But to paraphrase the Matrix, their brains, they've never used them before, which is one more reason the religion is so damaging to humanity.
So whether you can go back and resurrect the Greco-Roman and Christian worldview, I guess that's a possibility. It's not particularly a strong possibility for empirical rational philosophy, so I wanted to work on a system of ethics that would prove virtue, that would prove morality, that would crack the Humean distinction between the ought and the is, like you can't get an ought from an is. The ought generally has come from divine commandments, or failing that has come from the secular power of the state to punish people who don't conform to legal norms. Neither of those are philosophical fundamentally, so I work very hard on this.
Why would you want to go back? None of those systems work in the modern world. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. I would no more want to go back to a Christian worldview where, as he said, behavior is predicated on the belief that some imaginary man in the sky is going to punish you if you don't toe the line, than I would to a communist regime where the government drags you off to a gulag if you don't do what they say. These are systems that have been tried and over time have failed. Why would we want to try them again?
I was very informed by Aristotle's old dictum that says, hey, by all means, work on a system of ethics, more power to you. But if you end up with a system of ethics wherein, rape, theft, assault, and murder, the big four, are somehow good, well, then you've made a wrong turn at Albuquerque somewhere. You've gone in the wrong direction.
Now, that's an assertion, Stefan, but you haven't backed it up with anything but emotion. And that's really the problem with most of these supposed philosophical systems. They're all ultimately based on emotion. They're based on feelings. He's decided to pick 4 elements that he defines as moral without actually showing that they're objectively so. Just because most people would agree with him, at least in the Western world, that doesn't mean that his assertion is objectively correct. And I think this is the biggest problem with this so-called objective ethics. But we'll come back to that.
So I wanted to work with those sort of 4 cornerstones of ethics: rape, theft, assault, and murder. And if I could find a way to prove that those are wrong, then, hey, we're on the right path.
But you can't, because there's no objective definition of wrong. All you can do is show that most people in a particular culture disagree with them, and that's fine, I guess, but that doesn't make them objectively wrong. It just makes them emotionally common. If you went to some places in the Middle East, for example, rape might be seen as perfectly acceptable for the majority of the population. Does that mean it's not wrong now?
And this is revolutionary stuff. I just wanted to warn you just over the next few minutes. There's an old saying that says, the mind once stretched by a new idea never regains its original shape. This is going to be you in just a few minutes. So brace yourself, be aware, and get ready.
Wow. I mean, you're not full of yourself or anything, are you? But of course he is, because this is just an ego trip for him. And that's pretty standard stuff, unfortunately.
So the first question is there even such a thing as universally preferable behavior? Fine question. I'm glad that you rhetorically asked that.
Isn't it nice that he's talking to himself on your behalf, right? But it's a fair question because, no, I don't think there's anything universal about preferable behavior. To be universal, it would have to be held by 100% of the population with no dissenters. Can you think of any philosophical point that nobody in a given society disagrees with? Me neither.
The question would be this. Can you argue against universally preferable behavior without invoking universally preferable behavior?
Easily, because it demonstrably doesn't exist. Going back to his 4 standards, one is murder. Well, if everyone universally opposed murders, there would be no murders. But there are. Therefore, it can't be universal.
So universally preferable behavior is things that people do that they ought to do, that they should do. That's universal. Doesn't mean they always will do it. It's universally preferable behavior, not universally preferred behavior.
Which makes no sense whatsoever. If it's universally preferable, then it will be universally performed. He just wants to tell you what people ought to do, which brings us to Hume's is-ought problem. Just declaring arbitrarily that people ought to do a thing doesn't mean that it's a demonstrably correct thing to do. I don't know how you can make the case that there are any demonstrably correct things to do. Stefan is just telling you that what he says goes.
So it doesn't mean that people actually will do these things. It just means that they should do these things.
Says who? And why do you get to be the judge of ethics?
Like if you have diabetes, you should follow a certain health regimen and a certain diet. Doesn't mean you will, but the nutritionist can certainly say you should, based upon the facts at your disposal.
Yes, they can say that you should. And if you don't, there may be medical consequences for not following the nutritionist's advice. However, that doesn't obligate you to do anything. You have to make your own decisions on what you want to do and what consequences you're willing to accept. And since it affects you and only you, you have all the power to make those decisions.
So universally preferable behavior is not what people do and that they automatically do things. I mean, there would be no scientific nutrition if everything we wanted to eat turned out to be fantastically good for us. We have to go against our instincts and learn more about, health and medicine and nutrition in order to eat wisely or how to exercise like you want to exercise according to that good old Aristotelian mean. You don't want to exercise so little that you end up as a pear-shaped couch potato, but you don't want to exercise so much that you end up with like shin splints and tendinitis and arthritis in your 50s or something like that.
Well, what if you want arthritis in your 50s? Or what if you want to be a couch potato? Why do you get to decide for me how I end up? I mean, seriously, Stefan, authoritarian much?
So the question before us is there such a thing as universally preferable behavior?
No, there isn't. Next.
Now, interestingly enough, if you come up to me and you say, as many people have, Steph, you're totally wrong. There's no such thing as universally preferable behavior. What are you actually doing?
Being honest? And apparently I'm not the only one. We're pointing out that you're making assertions that simply do not stand up to reality. Is there something wrong with that?
Well, you're saying, Steph, the statement you're making, that there's such a thing as universally preferable behavior, is false.
Which it is, for reasons I've already gone into. But I'm sure you're going to try to spin it to stroke your own ego. Let's watch.
And truth is infinitely preferable to falsehood, and you should not enact the behavior of saying false things in the world.
Well, there's another wild assertion, as if anyone's surprised. Nobody actually said that. He simply asserted it as a means of discrediting his detractors, putting words into their mouths that simply didn't come from there.
You see how this works?
Yes, we do see how you invent arguments out of whole cloth. I'm just wondering how you don't see it.
You cannot oppose universally preferable behavior.
Sure I can. I just did. Of course, I'm just opposing the idea that it exists, just like I oppose the idea that gods exist. It's based on logic and reason and a complete lack of objective evidence to support it. But sure, go ahead and spin some more. Maybe if we wrapped you in copper wire, you generate an electric field.
Without invoking universally preferable behavior. You can't say someone is wrong without saying truth is objective.
I can say that you're an idiot, though, because you are. Because absolutely I can point out where someone is wrong, which you are, simply because their assertions don't measure up to the demonstrable facts. The only thing I said about truth is that you don't have it, but I'm sure your ego won't allow you to accept that, will it?
You can't say someone shouldn't say false things without saying that saying true things is infinitely preferable to saying false things.
Of course, I never said that, neither did anyone else. You did. You're playing with a straw man as though you have no idea what a logical fallacy is.
You cannot reject a universal statement without invoking a universal standard.
I'm not rejecting a universal statement. I'm saying that your universal statement is false. Your claim is not rationally justifiable.
So if people say there's no such thing as universally preferable behavior, they've just invoked universally preferable behavior. They're speaking a truth, they're asking other people to not speak falsehoods and so on. So it doesn't work.
You're a moron, Steph. You just are. You're a piss-poor philosopher if you can't see just how irrational you're being. But hey, we know. Ego comes first.
There's no possible way around this. People have been coming at me with this from 6 million different directions for 10 years or so. You can't get past it. It is an absolute. You cannot argue against universally preferable behavior.
Except it's already been done. You're just wearing your libertarian goggles to keep you from seeing it.
So given that there's no conceivable way to argue against universally preferable behavior, the only question that remains, and it's a big one, it's a doozy, the only question that remains is, what is universally preferable behavior. It has to be something, because you can't argue against it without invoking it. So the question is, what is it?
This is the same kind of horseshit that I see from the religious presuppositionalists all the time. That you can't argue against God without accepting God because God created logic and therefore you can't use logic unless God is real. You know, Matt Slick would be very proud of you, Stefan. And that's not something to be proud of.
A great question. Another great question. So the answer is as follows. In my brief homage to Canadian comedy, just picture you have in a room two guys, Bob and Doug. And you give one of them an iPod, you give one of them an iPad. And you say, guys, we're going to run a little experiment here. Let's run the experiment that theft is universally preferable behavior. Stealing, right, the removal of someone's property against their will. Stealing is universally preferable behavior. Now, go to it. What are they going to do? Well, they're going to snatch each other's stuff. One guy's going to grab the iPad, the other one's going to grab the iPod, then they're going to snatch it back, and they're going to continue to do this until you have pity on them and call a stop to the experiment.
That's a pretty dumb experiment. So let's try another one. Put Bob and Doug into the room and give Bob a nice steak dinner. Doug is homeless and hasn't eaten for a week. Tell Bob that he's not allowed to give Doug any food, but in fact, he has to eat it in front of him. And you know what's going to happen? Doug's going to go over there and take some of Bob's food because he's about to die of malnutrition. Apparently, given the circumstances, Doug doesn't think that stealing is universally evil behavior. And because he doesn't, the preferable behavior that you're trying to push isn't universal, is it?
Now, clearly, if they're grabbing and stealing from each other all the time,
exactly who steals every second of every day? Citation needed. Thieves, even kleptomaniacs, don't spend every waking moment just taking things at random from people. That's not how it works. What fantasy land do you live in, Stefan?
Doesn't that strike you as like that can't be a rational course of action? That can't be the morally good thing to do.
Which is why that doesn't happen in the real world. Why don't you try visiting once in a while?
Here's the thing. Physically, I guess you could do it. You could keep snatching stuff back and forth. But you understand, it's kind of weird, kind of exhausting, and you can't really do anything else. Because here's the thing. If you say X is the good, then the opposite of X must be the bad, right? If this is north, the opposite of north must be south.
Nobody is saying X is the good. Under some circumstances, it might be good to some people, and in others, it might be bad to others. You can't just argue that something is all good all the time or all bad all the time. It doesn't work that way.
So, if you say that the act of stealing is good,
good and bad are purely subjective, the opposite of objective that you apparently want.
Then not stealing, right? If you say violating people's property rights must be the good, then respecting people's property rights, i.e. not stealing, must be the bad. Now.
And I can think of tons of examples where not respecting people's property rights is objectively good for society. Now, take eminent domain. Now, I don't agree with a lot of cases where it's used, but if people need to lose their homes or businesses and be fairly compensated to build a hospital, then the good of the majority of people is served, and those who lose their homes are still able to relocate to a home that is as good or better as the one that they lost. It serves the public good. You're just wrong.
If you are napping, you can't be evil. I mean, I go more into why in the free book, freedomainradio.com/free. But if you're having a nap, you can't be evil. You know, parents always say this, you know, the kids maybe being a bit of a terror during the day and then they nap and it's like, oh, he looks like such an angel when he naps. So,
hey, I bet you I can find some instances where you can be napping and evil at the same time. I mean, if Jews were being slaughtered on Hitler's orders and Hitler went to bed, he'd still be evil because evil was still being done in his name on his orders. But you know, reality and all.
You can't be evil when you're sleeping. You can't be evil when you're in a coma.
So your ethical solution is to put everyone into a coma so they can't be bad. Gotcha.
And so if you prescribe a positive action, you must do X, not you should refrain from doing X. Because when you're sleeping, you can be not stealing, right? When you're stealing, you can be not murdering, you can be not assaulting people. And so if you have a positive action as your moral ideal, then when people aren't performing that moral action, they're not being good.
Ah, but that's a moral ideal, not an objective moral fact. And that's really where this whole thing falls apart. See, I'm not arguing against having moral precepts. I'm arguing against demanding that those moral precepts are universally correct just because you happen to hold them. These are your opinions, and you're certainly welcome to have opinions, but those opinions don't suddenly become facts because you really, really like them.
So when is the actual act of theft taking place, right? So Bob grabs Doug's iPad. Okay, he's got it. So in the moment that he transferred it, he's good, and then it vanishes because he's holding on to it. Oh no, he's holding on to it.
Honestly, in that example, and it's still a dumb experiment, but neither the iPad nor the iPhone, or whatever they were, are actually Bob or Doug's. They were given to them and presumably will be taken back at the end of the experiment. So Bob can't actually steal anything from Doug because Doug doesn't actually have anything to steal. Logic. Try it.
What happens now? Someone's got to steal from him, or he's, like, you understand it, it's a moment that you can be good.
Hopefully, it's a long series of moments that you can be good, but again, good and bad are subjective concepts that depend on the individuals involved and the situations they're involved in. The world isn't black and white, Stefan. Sorry.
Whereas if you have respect for property rights, you can be good at a continual basis until you actually go and steal something, and then you're bad for that moment, right? And then that badness follows you in terms of reparations.
And unfortunately, he seems to think that it is, just like the religious crazies out there who think their imaginary friend passes out the rules, and you either do what their God wants, as they individually interpret their God's supposed commands, or you're evil. Of course, there's no reason to think that any gods actually exist. Therefore, all the God's commands are empty, and rational people shouldn't care if they follow those commands or not.
Prescribing a positive action as a moral good is significantly problematic. So here's the challenge.
Prescribing anything as an automatic moral good is problematic. Again, because good and evil are subjective and not everyone agrees. But the reality is, you certainly can promote an action and have it stick. Probably not stealing, but let's say healthcare. Under Obamacare, you must have health insurance, and if you don't, you're penalized. And you can expand that to all taxes, which again, you must pay or you're strongly fined. Come on, Steph, this isn't that hard.
Physically, it's very, very difficult to enact thou shalt steal. Stealing is it. But here's an even better part. It is actually, my friends, impossible to achieve. Not just physically. It's impossible to achieve. Let me tell you why. So let's say I have some rusty old garbage bucket of a lawnmower, and I'm like, man, I don't want to trip over this thing. I'm inept mechanically, which I kind of am. And so I just, someone should take this thing away from me. All right. So what I do is I wheel it in its squeaky way up to the sidewalk, and I put a big sign on it saying free, or take me, or I'm yours, or whatever, right? And then you come along in a pickup truck, and you are mechanically inclined. I can fix this. Up you, and you drive off, right? Let's say I captured this on video. I got security cameras. And then I call up the cops and I say, someone just stole my lawnmower, right? Now, if they come and investigate, and the guy's going to say, well, here's the it's free sign. I saw it on the sidewalk. And they say, yeah, is this true? And I say, well, yeah, I put it on the sidewalk free, and the guy took it. And it's like, then that's not theft. You're inviting him to take it. It's like, but he took my property, yes, but not against your will. Because you clearly signaled that you didn't want the property anymore. It was open for anyone else to take.
That's a rather stupid example, though, isn't it? Who in their right mind is going to call the police after someone comes and takes something that you wanted them to take in the first place? Come on.
So theft can't occur if I want someone to steal from me. If I want someone to take my property, it's not theft. Stealing is not stealing if I want you to take the property, right?
Stealing isn't necessarily stealing, even if you don't want them to take it. Take taxation, which most libertarians pretend is theft because they don't want to pay the money, but that's not going to stop the government, either city, state, or federal, from doing so. And it's not theft because it's a consequence of you living within the city, state, or nation. You have to pay your fair share, whether you like it or not. And if you don't like it, leave! But libertarians aren't very good at exercising their freedom and going elsewhere. They just like to whine.
So, I mean, just to labor the point, right? You go to garage sales sometimes, I'm sure, and you see, okay, here's a box of free stuff, just free. You don't have to pay it, right? So, you can't steal from someone who wants you to take their property.
There might be people out there with psychological conditions that actually do want people to take their stuff. In fact, there are plenty of men who have a financial domination fetish where they enjoy women forcing them to give away their money. So is that theft? You tell me.
Now, if theft is universally preferable behavior, then Bob wants Doug to take his stuff, and Doug wants Bob to take his stuff. You understand? But because theft is universally preferable, I should want to steal and be stolen from.
Again, it depends on what you consider theft. Can you be swindled? Certainly, lots of people are. But in the moment, they willingly give away their money to con men who have tricked them into doing so. Theft or not, go ahead.
But if I want to be stolen from, I can't be stolen from.
Even though I've already shown that it can be.
It's not theft if I want someone to take. So theft cannot be universally preferable behavior. Now think of assault. Think of assault. Now, there are situations where I'm going to voluntarily go into an environment knowing I'm going to get hit. I'm not just talking about like wearing a MAGA hat on a leftist campus. I'm talking about like if I go into a boxing ring. Right? If I go into a boxing ring, I'm going to crack and be cracked and punch and be punched. I don't get to call up the cops and say, hey man, someone just assaulted me. It's like, where are you? I'm in a boxing ring. Then hang up. We got busy things to do. So this can even happen like in sports, right? You're playing street hockey. You get a hockey stick to the face. Oh, someone just assaulted me. What were you doing? Playing street hockey. It's like, hey man, that could happen, right? But you go after someone in a mall and you crack him in the face with a hockey stick. Well, that's assault, right?
Now, I'm glad he brought up those exceptions, because there are plenty of cases where people do voluntarily want to be attacked, assaulted, beat up, etc. In fact, it seems to me that I've heard of cases where people have gone out of their way to provoke an assault, specifically so they could go to the authorities and make the people who they provoked look bad. So again, this isn't as black and white as you'd like people to believe.
So if you're in a situation where you're either allowing yourself to be hit or accepting the risks of being hit, it can't be assault. It can't be assault if it's voluntary. So it's the same thing with Bob and Doug in the room. Okay, you say to them, okay, enact assault is universally preferable behavior. Well, they're just clawing at each other and beating each other up. But because it's universally preferable behavior, you want to hit and you want to be hit.
Some people do. That's the thing. There are people who derive sexual pleasure from being abused. There's no question about that. Therefore, claiming that not being assaulted is the universally preferable behavior is simply factually untrue. If I can come up with a single example where it's not, then it's not universal. But I guess that majority preferable behavior doesn't have the same ring.
Because you can't be asymmetrical, right? You can't say it's universal, but each person needs to have opposite desires. One person wants to retain his property, the other person wants to steal it. One person wants property rights, the other person wants to violate property rights. It's no longer universal.
It's not universal at all, because there are exceptions to your rule.
You understand? It has to be universal for it to be ethical, or to be philosophical for that matter. Otherwise, it's personal taste or culture or whatever, right?
Which is, in fact, the truth, but the truth gets in the way of your narrative, so you can't acknowledge reality while living in your little libertarian fantasy land.
So, as far as assault goes, I guess they could keep pounding on each other, but because they want to hit and be hit, it's no longer assault. Assault is when you don't want to be hit. Rape is when you don't want to have sexual activity performed on you.
Except for people who have rape fantasies, for people who derive pleasure from being assaulted, for people who have sexual fetishes about having their money taken from them, and people who want to be killed. I mean, death by cop is a thing, isn't it? It's where you go out and commit some heinous crime, specifically so the police will shoot you and kill you. But I guess all those exceptions don't exist because they don't play into Stefan's narrative.
So this works all along the line. Rape, theft, assault, murder. Not only is it almost impossible to enact them physically on a continual basis, not only does it mean that people who are sleeping are immoral, but it actually destroys the definition of rape, theft, assault, and murder for them to be universally preferable behaviors. This is how we know for sure, 150%, no doubt, no hesitations, rape, theft, assault, and murder cannot be virtuous, cannot be good in any way, shape, or form. See, that wasn't that hard, was it? It's funny, because ethics, there's lots of complicated systems of ethics, but the problem is we really need to be able to explain ethics to like a 2 or 3-year-old. And I went through all this stuff with my daughter using figurines and stuff. I went through all this stuff with my daughter when she was 2.5. She got it, no problem. She's a pretty smart cookie, of course, but it's relatively easy to explain. And I've actually got a podcast called The ABCs of UPB about how to explain this stuff to kids. So
this is a philosophy that's easy to dumb down for kids, but unfortunately, I don't think it has much substance beyond that. It's intended for people who aren't all that bright. But then again, most ethical systems are. They're intended for people who just don't want to think about ethics on a case-by-case basis. They just want to have a roadmap to follow, and they don't want to have to ponder the hard questions. Religion caters to the same kind of people.
We need an ethical system that kids can understand because we don't want them to hit and punch and steal, and right? So it's actually pretty simple, right? I mean, there's a click moment where it takes a little moment to get it, but once you get it, you've got it, and you won't ever unget it.
I've got it. It's just not true. Therefore, I reject it.
Right, now you know, without the guns of the state being pointed at you, without theological commandments, you know why respecting persons and property are good.
For those who agree with you that they're good. And I think that most people do that, but certainly not all. And without universal agreement, you can't have a universal system.
And you know why doing the opposite is bad.
Again, good and bad are subjective and frankly a little childish. If you have to tell people what is good and what is bad, you're dealing with the immature. People can make their own determinations on what they think is good and what they think is bad. But people like Stefan here, people like religious shysters, they spend a lot of time making value judgments for the people they talk to because they want to lead people around by their emotions, not their intellect. So, not really a surprise there.
Now, there will be people who will rape and steal and murder and assault. That will still happen. But here's the problem. The problem, wasp. Well, 2 wasps, I guess. The problem is that it's not individual criminals who are the problem in society. It is not the thief at night. It's not the mugger. It's not the person who's going to assault you. Because you can take reasonable steps to avoid those things. The problem is not individual bad actors. The problem is moral theories that justify either rape or theft or assault or murder.
I don't think I've ever seen one of those. Citation needed.
The problem is moral theories that justify either rape or theft or assault or murder. And there are lots of those in the world, all over the place. And you can defend yourself against individual criminals, but those who are pursuing bad ethical theories through the power of the state, through the power of various kinds of compulsion, those people are where the real risk is in society.
No, the real risk in society are people like you who don't live in the real world, who only see the world in black and white, and who think that they can talk their way into a wonderful planet. You're simply never going to talk the planet into peace. Peace has to be imposed, and you don't like that imposition. You've got this really bizarre idea that you can convince everyone to follow your ethical mumbo-jumbo, and suddenly everyone will. You, Stefan, are insane.
So there will be individual bad actors. UPB is not going to make everyone good.
It's not going to make anyone good.
But it is going to do a full frontal D-Day style assault on irrational, anti-rational, anti-human ethical theories, and that's where the real danger to us and our future lies. So I hope that you will check out the book, freedomainradio.com/free. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Stefan Molyneux. Use our affiliate link if you have some shopping to do at fdrurl.com/Amazon. And don't forget to join our brand spanking new mailing list. New book coming out August 2017, The Art of the Argument. You'll love it. It's great. Have yourself a wonderful day, everyone.
And we're back to patting himself on the back, which is pretty typical for Stefan Molyneux. He loves jumping up and down, screaming, "Look at me! Look at me!" It's kind of his thing. And frankly, it's not all that impressive. I really hate libertarians who live in a ridiculous fantasy world, who think that rights are magical and people are inherently good. That's simply not the world we actually live in. But people like Molyneux can't tell the difference between an is and an ought. They think that the way they think the world ought to be is the way that it actually is, but they're wrong. I mean, I think the world ought to be a certain way, but I'm not delusional enough to think that's actually how it is, or that we'll get there anytime soon, if at all. There's a difference between the ideal and the actual. I get that. Lots of libertarians do not. And that's a problem, and I think most people can see that. Well, most people except for the crazed libertarians. That's why they get nowhere fast. Because they're nuts.
Everything changes.